My goodness, where to start after that introduction? It's such a pleasure to see so many people here tonight. I know that getting people here tonight has involved planes, trains, taxis, childcare commitments, shuffling around the work commitments, or simply not going home from work on time. So I am deeply indebted to the time and the effort that you've all made in coming here tonight. It means so much. As you can see on the screen behind me, the title of my inaugural lecture is Through the Transitional Justice Looking Glass, Unpicking Truth, Denial and Contested Victimhood. And before going any further into the lecture, I wanted to explain the idea of the looking glass as it has a dual function for me tonight. As many of you know, the idea of the looking glass comes from Lewis Carroll's famous novel, Through the Looking Glass, and what Alice found there. And in the novel, as Alice looks through the looking glass, as you can see on the bottom of the screen, the world that she sees is reversed. And it's not quite as it seems, whereby walking away from something brings you closer to it. Chessmen, or perhaps more correctly, chesswomen, are alive, and nursery rhyme characters are real. And that brings me to my first idea of Through the Looking Glass, because standing here tonight feels like I'm having my own Alice in Wonderland experience. It feels like I'm looking through the looking glass. I never expected to be an academic. I didn't exactly have much of a career plan, as my family know. And I certainly didn't ever think that a career in academia would be something for me or where I would fit. So to be giving my inaugural lecture tonight feels a bit mind-blowing, but here I am. And that trajectory would not have been possible without all of the people in this room. When I got promoted to professor in July 2024, I did the obligatory self-congratulatory posts on social media, and I made sure I shared it far and wide. But at the same time, I thanked everybody who had supported me. And I describe my promotion as a team effort. And so tonight, I want to publicly thank the A-team. First up, my family, lots of whom who are here tonight. To my mum and dad in the front row, Gillian and Paul, and to my brother Robin and my sister-in-law Lydia over on the other side of the room, thank you for everything. I was always given the freedom to make my own choices, to pursue the things I wanted to pursue, and to come to my own conclusions, and that's a huge privilege. At the same time, the message always was that if you want anything in life, you have to work for it, you have to do the right thing, and you have to do things right. And particularly for my dad, you have to take every opportunity to travel. Strangely enough, given where my career has taken me over the years, the point about travel has made one parent very envious, and the other one slightly less enthusiastic about where I might be in the world, but also responsible for the most important job, looking after my cat. Thank you never really seems enough, but thank you for the support, the guidance, the patience, etc., etc. Second in line are my academic colleagues. Obviously, Professor Kieran McAvoy and I have known each other for quite some time, and Kieran has preempted a lot of what I was going to say. Kieran taught me as a master's student and supervised me through my PhD, and being taught by him and supervised by him has been absolutely formative in the development of my career, but also allowing me to be the person who gets to stand here today. Poor Kieran hasn't been able to shake me off since 2006. He's been there through all the highs, all the lows that he alluded to, but also has given up his time to do the introduction tonight. So here's to many more years and getting a certain book written. It's a public commitment now. Besides Kieran, in the mentoring stakes is Professor Anne-Marie McAlinden. Anne-Marie is the academic that everybody should aspire to be. And on top of doing everything that she does so brilliantly, has been incredibly generous with her time, her expertise and her friendship, and has constantly encouraged me to develop as a scholar and to take up opportunities. It's always an honour, it's a pleasure, and it's been a total game changer. Outside the School of Law here at Queen's, we're really fortunate to have the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute just across the road. And the Mitchell Institute has been absolutely formative as well in the development of my career. Professors Richard English, John Brewer and Hastings Donnan have been sounding boards, promoters of my ideas, travel companions, wine tasting companions, Hastings, facilitators and supporters of my work. That you've all attempted to come here tonight. It didn't quite come off for some of them, but they all attempted to come here tonight. It means the absolute world. And then also, as Kieran alluded to, thirdly and beyond academia, as everybody now knows, I am definitely one of those people that never outgrew their childhood obsession with horses. Horses give you the perfect antidote to academic life. They don't care about the paragraph that you're writing, and they really don't care that you suspect your students don't really like you. But they take you outside. You're building a relationship with half a ton of animal. But they're also a huge time commitment, particularly when you're working in a very full-time job. There's loads of my horsey friends here tonight who I actually don't recognise out of their horsey gear. But thank you for all the support and for keeping the show on the road. So, with the formalities out of the way, now I get to bore you with the subject matter of my lecture and detain you from the wine and cheese that I'm extremely relieved to see has arrived outside. And this is where I get to bring in the second formulation of going through the looking glass, whereby returning to that idea of reality being inverted or round the wrong way, it can equally apply to periods of conflict and transition, where cultures of denial and silence persist in the aftermath of peace processes and mechanisms designed to deal with a legacy of a contested past, where contested memories continue to dominate the public and the political imagination, and where victimhood is often constructed, reproduced, and politicised in ways which do not and cannot offer an expansive understanding of harm or reflect the messy reality of victimhood and victimisation. And that's the subject of this lecture tonight, where I'm going to attempt to argue that going through the transitional justice looking glass means countering denial and silence by having a comprehensive examination of the past, and also the need to embrace complexity in our understanding of victimhood and victimisation. And to do that, I've divided my lecture into 4 parts, as you can see on the screen here. Part 1, the questions. What are the questions and the underpinning ideas that have motivated my career and the projects that I have pursued? Second is the discipline. Where do I sit as an academic in this kind of hybrid interdisciplinary space? Third are the major projects and pieces of work that I've undertaken, my academic contribution. And then finally, into the so what question. And I want to say, with the so what question, it's more than academia, and you'll see that at the end. So, the questions that I have been working on and the questions that have motivated and informed my career to date, and some of which I plan to develop further in the future. These aren't all of the questions, these are more of a highlight reel, but nevertheless, it's questions about what role do denial and silence play in opposition to truth recovery or in terms of dealing with the legacy of a violent past. The related questions of who is a victim. Why do we see some forms of victimhood, and why are other forms of victimhood and harm made invisible? Or why are certain victims' voices silenced, while others are broadcast at an incredibly loud volume? But also, why do we use this language of victims being a deserving victim or an undeserving victim? What purpose does that serve? And then alluding to Kieran's point about me being dragging my unfortunate colleagues around graveyards and other sites, I'm interested in the role, particularly in this country, but not exclusively, what role does our physical landscape play in how victimhood is constructed and reproduced? And perhaps both underpinning all of these questions, but potentially also formulating a future research project. What are the lives of dead bodies? When we die, I want to argue that we don't just die, we have posthumous political and social lives. So those are the questions that will echo, I hope, throughout this presentation. And seeking to explore these questions has led me to kind of find an academic home, I think, in the field or the world of what we call transitional justice. And for those of you who are less familiar with the term transitional justice, which is a good portion of this room, and I think that's a healthy thing actually, it's an interdisciplinary area that draws on other disciplines like law, criminology, human rights, and political science. And in the broadest possible terms, transitional justice is about the processes and the mechanisms that are designed to deal with societies that are emerging from periods of conflict and human rights abuses. Those processes and mechanisms that are designed to deal with that legacy of human rights violations and large-scale abuses. And the aims of transitional justice are as multiple and diffuse as the definition itself, but transitional justice facilitated through things like truth commissions, international criminal trials or tribunals, reparations programs, apologies, forms of institutional reform or vetting. They have various different competing aims, but broadly speaking, those aims rotate around the idea of delivering truth, justice, accountability, acknowledgement, reparations, and often that's for some of the most vulnerable and some of the most marginalised people in society. And working in the field of transitional justice has done 3 different things for me. As you can see in the sensible portion of the slide in the box, it has allowed me to develop interest and expertise on the themes that you see up there. So around dealing with the past, victims, former combatants, what use do atrocity sites play, or what use can they play in post-conflict, forms of harm such as conflict-related sexual violence, and the political lives of the dead. It's definitely transitional justice as a field is a global enterprise. You don't need to go too far away from the TV screen or a newspaper every day to see another society embroiled in conflict or trying to deal with the legacy of that conflict. And that, for me, has facilitated a huge amount of international travel. And in part, that has been enormous fun. As you can see with the photograph of me, I was supposed to be on my way to interview a former commander of the FARC in Bogota. And my colleague, Professor Luke Moffat, who couldn't make it here tonight, had to pay the owner of the alpacas quite a lot of money to get me released from the alpacas, as we were about to be late for our interview. But it's been an incredible opportunities to travel, to meet people, to work with some of the most marginalised and vulnerable people in the hardest moments of their lives. And so what I wanted to say was, quite often, when we do look at social media, or we look at projects that our colleagues are doing enviously, and we see the blue skies and you see the travel, it looks fabulous. But behind the blue skies and the opportunities to travel, as these photographs here show, working from the top left round, this is the buffer zone in the UN buffer zone in Nicosia in Cyprus. The photograph to the right of that is a separation wall in Hebron. What you probably can't see terribly clearly is the woman on the right of that separation wall. Her eyes have been blacked out and her mouth has been stapled shut. And there's a petrol bomb, which is kind of the white smudgy thing. And in that petrol bomb, it's the explosion of women's rights. Down at the bottom, we have a S21, or Tuol Sleng, which is a former high school in Cambodia, which turned it into a torture centre by the Khmer Rouge. And the last photograph is actually Karen, sitting over in the Ulster Museum when we took some students over to see Colin Davidson's portraits of victims of the conflict here. Because it's not the highlight reel, it's not the pictures that appear on my Facebook and the opportunity to travel. What it is about is the legacies and the lived realities of what these photographs show. And that's legacies and lived realities of genocide, displacement, violent death and injury, torture, collusion, sexual violence, and so on. And it's these forms of harm and the response to them that has structured much of my work to date. And to give you a flavour of that work, I wanted to highlight 4 of the projects that I've worked on, or 4 of my kind of key areas, all of which rotate around the idea of going through the transitional justice looking glass and questioning what we see there. So the first project has its genesis, as Kieran spoke to earlier, has its genesis in my PhD, which I completed here in 2010, which is unbelievably almost 15 years ago. And the PhD was really structured against the backdrop of probably the first major intervention in Northern Ireland around creating proposals and mechanisms to deal with the legacy of the conflict. So that will be familiar to some of you. It's called the work of the consultative group in the past. And really at that time, we knew a lot, both locally but also internationally. We knew a lot about the reasons for doing truth recovery, but we didn't really know a lot about the reasons why you shouldn't investigate the past or why people are opposed to investigating the past. But what we did know were arguments were made why, for example, victims or former members of armed groups or political actors, when they did articulate their opposition to truth recovery or dealing with the past, it tended to be around arguments like, well, this would be politically destabilizing, or it'd be socially disruptive, or it would re-traumatize victims and survivors. And my argument was, that's all true, but that's also not enough. There has to be deeper political, ideological, sociological reasons why armed organizations, members of the security forces, political elites reject dealing with the past. And that's what this project was based around in 2010, against the backdrop of the work of the consultative group in the past. It also evolved around other interventions around dealing with the past. And although the picture has changed, as you'll see later, like the scene in real terms, It hasn't really changed because we still don't have a comprehensive process of dealing with the past. But what I argued in this book is, yes, it's fine to say you maybe traumatize people, and that's all true, maybe socially disruptive by opening the Pandora's box on the past. But you actually have to think about the identity and the self-imagination of our stakeholder groups. So how, in this case, how do the security forces, loyalist paramilitary organizations, and unionist political elites, how did their self-imagination of themselves and their own collective memory inform their attitudes towards what happened during the conflict, what they observed, what they may have condoned, turned a blind eye to, what they may have perpetrated? What was their usable past? And that links to themes around denial. I've been very much influenced by the work of Stan Cohen on his book, States of Denial. Is probably the most incredible book ever written. And that's about everything from literal denial to no, it didn't happen, to campaigns around who's a better victim, or a condemnation of the condemners, or the argument that we cannot judge things retrospectively. It's also about the politics of victimhood, as you'll see later. That's been a recurring theme in my book. So can we, or should we, divide people into camps of innocent victims and guilty victims? But also for the constituencies that feature in this book, it was also about mixed notions of loyalty to the past, the loyalty of the security forces, for example, and by investigating the actions of the RUC during the conflict, effectively things like torture, shoot to kill, and collusion, were you somehow betraying the sacrifice that they had made during the conflict? As you can see on the screen, it was a successful piece of work. And some of the articles related to this, one was awarded the British Side of Criminology Book Article Prize, and the other one was shortlisted for the Socio-Legal Studies Article Prize. And that was a piece on one piece on the security forces and one piece based on interviews with loyalist paramilitary organizations. So that's project number one. Project number two took me to Cambodia with my colleague, Lauren Dempster, who's here tonight, and our former colleague, Dr. Rachel Colleen. And it had kind of come to my attention as I was sort of developing my ideas around the construction and the politicization of victimhood that if you go on TripAdvisor or any travel blogs online, there's a lot of emphasis on going to places of so-called dark tourism. And there's a bit of a fairly repulsive stream of screenshots online where people have taken Auschwitz selfies. And there's actually a dark tourism program on Netflix. There's all sorts of really kind of weird, repulsive stuff. And in line with my interest in the politics of victimhood, I started to think, well, actually, where are the victims' voices in these sites? Do we actually see an accurate and adequate representation of victims here? Because that's what these sites at the end of the day are based on, the loss of life and huge violations of human rights. And so we got funding from the Global Challenges Research Fund that allowed us to undertake a period of in-depth fieldwork in Cambodia. And we were asking questions around how victims were represented in former sites of atrocity during the genocide in Cambodia. And that was a mixed portfolio of sites. So some of those sites, as you can see on the screen, this is Trung Ek, also known as the Killing Fields in Cambodia. It's a site of mass graves. This is a memorial stupa. And actually the positioning and the disaggregation of human remains to display bones like this is actually completely opposite to Buddhist cultural beliefs. So there's problem number one. So we went to high profile places like this, and S21, the torture centre, but we also went to a number of other sites of atrocity and loss of life, mass loss of life, which are not on the tourist trail at all, and we don't see or hear of them. So we were asking questions like, who is recognised as a victim in these sites? How is responsibility for past horrors represented? Which sites become tourist-facing attractions? And why certain narratives of the past are prioritised? And we found our findings kind of rotated around three interlinked themes. That when we think of atrocity sites, particularly those that have a public-facing dimension and which claim to represent the needs, the experience, and the voices of victims, and for those students who are coming to Crumlin tomorrow, take note. This is about three themes of selectivity, visibility, and authenticity. So just for example, in Cambodia, selectivity relates to the idea of which atrocity sites have become tourist-facing attractions and which crimes of the Khmer Rouge are visible and represented there. So there's a huge visibility or an over-representation nearly of torture and murder, but there's absolutely nothing about sexual violence, forced labour or starvation, which were equally pernicious. We also need to think about the victims that we see or the victims that we don't see. Lots of you will know the image from Cambodia. It's really famous. It's a sort of a sepia image, and it's all faces. It looks like faces of victims on a display board. They're actually Khmer Rouge perpetrators. They're members of the Khmer Rouge. So what you're actually seeing, and I don't disagree with the idea of commemorating that loss of death, but you're actually led to believe that they are civilians. They were not. They were actually members. They were perpetrators of genocide themselves. And then authenticity was our final theme, and that's about how victimhood is produced, perceived and interpreted in atrocity sites. And sometimes what you do see, both in Cambodia and elsewhere, is something of like a horrorizing the horror, where you don't need to dress it up and you don't need to add extra shackles or blood splatters on the wall. It's bad enough as it is. Project number 3 then is the most recent one. This is my most recent book, which was published earlier this year, Constructing Victimhood. And the book is based around this idea of a critical examination of how victimhood is constructed, reproduced and contested in societies moving out of periods of conflict and transition. And the starting point for this book really was the argument that while criminology and transitional justice have done much to promote recognition of the complex victim and to encourage a move away from conceptualizing victimhood in terms of just innocence or guilt, to restrict our understanding of victimhood to these variables is only to give us a limited and a partial understanding of victimhood. Because it doesn't, if we just talk about innocent victims or guilty victims or even complex victims, it doesn't give us that expansive understanding of harm or reflect the messy reality of victimhood and victimization in situations of conflict and transition. And of course, if we claim that our interventions in the space of dealing with the past are victim-centred, then we need to have as expansive an understanding of victimhood as is possible. So the book is based on over 70 in-depth interviews with victims and survivors of the Northern Ireland conflict, right across the political spectrum, and also people who were victims of different types of actors. And in addition to considering those questions about, who fits within the legal definition of a victim or maybe sits outside of that, it's actually more prudent, I argue in the book, to consider, should we talk in terms of hierarchies of victimhood? What do we miss when we just conceptualise victims as good or bad victims? Because what we see in Northern Ireland is very clear on the surface. It's a very clear hierarchy of victimhood, where some victims are deemed more worthy or more undeserving of their fate. But actually, if you look at both constituencies, in broad terms, the Republican constituency, the Unionist constituency, they all have their own internal hierarchies and their own internal good and bad victims. We also need to think about the voice of victims. Why do we hear about certain atrocities so much? Why do we hear certain victims' voices so much? What happens to those voices that we don't see and the experiences that are falling in between the cracks? What happens when decisions are made about the quality of somebody's voice? So this was made really powerfully in the report of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So after apartheid, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had hearings from victims and perpetrators. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has had since come into considerable scrutiny and critique for prioritising the voice of the forgiving victim, because South Africa wanted to have that narrative of reconciliation, racial reconciliation. And so they elevated the voice of the forgiving victim. We're a little bit different here, but we do tend to pick victims' voices that fit the political mood music or that are used to advance particular causes. But also, as you'll see later on, for many victims and survivors, they feel that they get frozen. You become the widower of atrocity X. You become the daughter of the judge who was killed, and they feel that their voices are frozen and restricted to that moment in time, and they're not allowed to or not able to evolve beyond that or articulate other perspectives, or articulate other forms of experience. So moving on, we also need to think about the theme of silence. So just as we might oversee or overhear some forms of victimhood and some victims' voices, we also need to think about the forms of victimhood that remain silenced. And there's multiple reasons for that. For some people, staying silent can be an act of dignity. It's deemed to be more private if you keep it within yourself. For others, it's about protection. Like, you don't want to raise your head above the parapet in case you bring trouble back to your door. For others, it's fear. People still in this jurisdiction and many other similar places around the world, they still live in fear of recrimination. But on the more problematic side, there's variants of uncomfortable victimhood, those forms of victimhood that don't suit either side in Northern Ireland to publicly discuss or admit responsibility for. So one form of that would be victimhood of informers, who the Republican community have a great narrative around dealing with the past and transitional justice, but they will not touch the issue of informers because that's too problematic. Likewise, within the Republican movement again, there is a huge issue around sexual violence perpetrated on women within the Republican community by members of that community, but also women who experience sexual violence while in prison. And again, the senior leadership of the Republican movement will not touch that issue. It's too problematic. And then finally is my obsession with haunting and ghosts. And there's a lot, you'll see there's some really lovely newspaper headlines in Northern Ireland that capture this about how Northern Ireland is haunted by its past and how the skeletons in the closet continue to rattle. And what I argue in the book is that the fact that we haven't dealt with the past, it continues to haunt, and it haunts the lives of those who are living. And it haunts our physical landscape, but it also perpetuates trauma. We have one of the highest rates of post-traumatic stress disorder in Western Europe. We have some of the highest rates of prescription medication. We have the highest rate of young male suicide in Western Europe. That is all, of course, intimately related to the conflict. So that has been the most recent project. And then the project to wrap up the 4 projects that I am beginning to work on, which, as I said earlier, I think in some ways both underpins all of the previous projects, but also is a standalone project in its own right. And that's about the political lives of dead bodies. I know, it's pretty grim. And that's the question now that I'm interested in is what role do the missing play as actors and actants when we're dealing with a legacy of non-recent institutional abuse? And of course, as everybody in this room knows, the island of Ireland in particular, north and south, has a profound and deeply problematic legacy of historical institutional abuse. And the exhumation in Galway, a Tuam mother and baby home, began in June of this year, where there are approximately 796 infants buried in a septic tank. And they were buried by the Bon Secours nuns, a religious order. And what's been really interesting in terms of the evolution of kind of dealing with the legacy of historical institutional abuse on the island of Ireland is that there's been a range of what we would call transitional justice mechanisms used in a domestic context. So there's been commissions of inquiry, truth commission type bodies, there's been apologies, attempts at reparation schemes, and opening archives. So kind of the transitional justice toolkit has been employed to deal with the legacy of institutional abuse. But silence and denial continue on the part of the state in respect of the state and the church in respect to their role in this scandal and how they've been able to continue to turn a blind eye to the abuse and the death of women and children. And so this project will situate the dead as neither passive nor mute, but social and political actors. And I'm driven by Laia Kent's assertion that the dead and missing are complex and lively. They are not passive and mute. And so while the exhumation of human remains obviously has a probative and an evidential value, when we think about the exhumation of bones and remains at Tuam in County Galway, it may be the intervention that has more impact in countering those entrenched cultures of denial and silence on the part of the church and state. But it also means we can reinscribe grievable lives, to use Judith Butler's terms. The lives of these infants and babies, and indeed their mothers, were wiped in the cruelest possible way from the historical record. And having the bones to hand, quite literally, may be a way to reinscribe and to re-honour those infants and their mothers. And so it can make victims of institutional abuse known and knowable, when up to this point in time, every effort has been made to conceal and to make those horrors unknown and unknowable. So those are the 4 projects that have structured my work and have rotated around that idea of going through the transitional justice looking glass. And if we put it into academic terms, we're always asked in academic terms, well, what's the so what? So I have 2 different boxes here, which kind of which reflect, I think, some of the work that has inspired me the most, but also some of the work that I think is most powerful in explaining, for example, why we should counter denial in silence. And that, for example, is Michael Ignatieff's idea of narrowing the range of permissible lies. Like, we'll never have one truth. You know, if you all leave this room tonight and I get hold of you at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, everyone will have a different memory of tonight, a different truth of tonight. So obviously, emerging from conflict, how could you possibly have one truth? It's simply not possible nor desirable. But also, if we're going to live somewhere in that grey zone, it also does mean getting rid of the junk and the myths and the distortions that are simply not true. And it also means having to look in the eye the stuff that we maybe don't want to hear. So as Hannah Arendt has said, the challenge is precisely to see precisely what the past was and to endure that knowledge. But also when we think about complicating understandings of victimhood, it's about this idea, as I argued in the book, of embracing narrative complexity. So the first quote is from Sergio Jaramillo Caro, who was the former High Commissioner for Peace in Colombia. And he referred to this era, he said this in 2014 actually, but he referred to this as the era of victims. And I think if this is really the era of victims, then we really need to rethink the scope and the bounds of how we conceptualize victims and victimhood. So whether that's adopting like the idea of it's a shape-shifting of humanity in times of crisis, or the fact that it's not really accurate to talk about the pure victim. So those are the so what points in academic terms. But as I said earlier, the so what for me means going beyond academia. And what I wanted to do in the second substantive part of this presentation is to let the words of victims and survivors, who I have had the pleasure of interviewing, I wanted to let their words speak. And I want to let these words, of course, obviously, and most importantly, stand in the context of the passage of new legislation that's making its way through Westminster again on establishing new mechanisms for dealing with the legacy of the Northern Ireland conflict. So why is truth important? For some victims, it's about acknowledgement, as you can see on the screen. For others, it's about restoring dignity. As this individual said, it really is the dignity of their loved one that they're fighting for. What they represented in life, that's what it's about. But for other people, and don't forget, with the passage of time, whether it is here, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in South Africa, people have been at this for generations. There is a profound passage of time, and many people feel like they can't give up, they can't rest until they've had their truth or they've had their day in court. And that, you're now talking about quite elderly people. So for some people, getting truth or getting justice or acknowledgement, it's about existing, but moving into the ability to live in the present. But we also need to answer questions and to contextualize death. So as one of my interviewees said, people don't want them like this huge grand thing. They want to know, why did it happen to me? Why did I lose limbs? Why was it me? And for another person said, well, sometimes the most comforting or the best thing that you can do is to explain to someone is because you're ordinary. This was not predetermined. You were not singled out. In fact, and it wasn't even the case that you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. In fact, you were probably in the right place at the right time, like your place of work, doing your shopping. You didn't look at somebody the wrong way. You didn't irritate someone from the other community. It's just because you were ordinary, and that's the heartbreaking truth. But for other people, it's about dismantling myths and falsehoods. And I appreciate that this is a rather long quote to put on the screen, so I'll give you a second to read through it. So this is an interview with a relatively young man. His father was killed by loyalist paramilitaries, and some point in time after his death, they lived in a Republican community in West Belfast. Some point in time after his father's death, a painting of his father appeared on a wall mural, and the family didn't know anything about this. Their permission was not asked for. They simply knew nothing about it. And when this individual's mother said, look, I don't want my husband's name up there, he had nothing to do with armed groups. He was completely apolitical. You can see the response she was given. She was told where to go. And they said, while paramilitary organisations may argue that they have the right to memorialise the dead, as this example illustrates, those practices of memorialization can not only be profoundly traumatizing and re-traumatizing for families because they lose control over their ownership of the dead and they lose control over their private grief, but it can also be a profound misappropriation of somebody's identity and suggesting that someone was involved in something that they were absolutely not involved in. So it's like a double death or a double victimization for many people. But we also need, as I said earlier, to think about the so what in terms of how we understand victimhood. And so the first quote here on the screen is probably, I suppose, the gold standard in terms of political generosity and nuance and complexity that comes oftentimes from those who have actually been on the sharp receiving end of violence. And this is an interview by someone who was seriously physically injured. And this is his response to how he understands victimhood. And it's profoundly generous, but as I said, it's often the people who have that lived reality who are actually able to make these statements. But on the other hand, we also need to think about not just the complexity of who victimizes and what that victimization can look like, particularly over the life course. We also want to think about the range and often layered and intersectional nature of harms. So one of the areas of dealing with the past in Northern Ireland or talking about legacy issues in Northern Ireland that hasn't really been dealt with is not just in relation to gender-based violence or sexual violence, but also sometimes how a husband or the male head of the family was killed and male predators in the local community effectively moved in and took control of that family, and sometimes that spiraled into abuse of the women and the children. So it's not just about the complexity of who does what, but also about the layered and intersectional nature of harm. For others, it's about flattening hierarchies of victimhood, to this idea that some forms of victimhood are more pure or more innocent than others, or that some are entirely guilty or deserving of their fate. In fact, as this interviewee suggests, and he is someone who lost their brother. Their brother was an 11-year-old child playing in the street, just randomly shot. This is about recognising the hurt and the harm that cuts right across all societies affected by violence, but also the fact that it's often those people, victims, again, who have first-hand experience of this, who are the most nuanced and reflective in offering up these statements. The idea that grief is grief. Everybody experiences, it doesn't matter where it came from. There is commonality in that basic experience. And then finally, this idea of doing it differently. Doing it differently can cut loads of different ways. For the first interviewee here, it's about challenging the politicisation and the use and abuse of victims in Northern Ireland. So whether that is, as we have all seen, at times of political change or times of peace processes or interventions around dealing with the legacy of the Northern Ireland conflict, politicians and victims groups on both sides of the political divide have been very quick to use and abuse victims. And then when the moment is off and when the spotlight has gone, they drop them. And that is re-traumatizing. It's also just morally and ethically wrong. So it's about challenging the politicization of victimhood. But for other people, it's about letting people be people and not just reducing people to that one moment in time. So this lady here, she said, she's always defined as this, like, oh, you're the girl whose daddy was killed. And she said, yes, I am, but I'm also a mother. I really enjoy cooking. I play netball. I like going out. I said, I want more. I don't just want to be frozen and reduced to this moment in time. So to go back to my starting point, which was about this idea of going through the looking glass, whether that's personally as scholars, whether that's about pushing ourselves, finding our mentors, finding our teams, keeping on going when it gets hard with the writing or hard with the grant writing, or whether it's about transitional justice, the world that I inhabit, about going through, questioning what we see, and making sure that whatever we do, we are victim-centred in our response to legacies of human rights violations. Thank you.